The Arcane Formulas. By William Walker Atkinson. Lesson 5. Will Focalization. The neophyte who has advanced to the stage in which, in the ancient occult parlance, he has found himself, has discovered that his real self is something far different from anything that he ever had imagined it to be. Instead of being an entity with distinctly marked characteristics and personal peculiarities, he discovers that it is a something the nature of which can be stated only in the sense of potentiality. We do not mean for a moment that the ego is existent only in a potential sense. On the contrary, it is actually existent in the most extreme and positive sense. In fact, its existent being is endowed with such a degree of actuality that all else seems to fade into relative non-existence. There is no question of I am not about the ego. It is first, last, and always a something of which the positive I am can, and must be, asserted. It is only when we come to examine the nature, attributes, and qualities of this I am ego, that we are forced to use the terms of potentiality instead of actuality. Let us consider this a little further. For in its understanding lies the solution of many occult paradoxes. In the first place, if we are keen analysts, and understand the precise terms of philosophical psychology, we will see that the formulas for establishing the ego, and the practice of the exercises arising therefrom, have divorced from the ego the usual attributes, characteristics, and personal peculiarities which are popularly supposed to belong to, and to be inseparably connected with it. Setting aside as the not I, first one feeling and then another, first one emotion and then another, first one characteristic and then another, first one personal peculiarity and then another, and placing them in turn in the not I category, the neophyte finds that after he has stripped the ego of all the attributes of personality, there is still a something left, an irreducible element, an insoluble residuum, a sure, or something which while actually existent yet is incapable of being described, expressed, or designated by rational terms, a final algebraical X, or unknown ultimate element. As to the existence of this unknown element, or ego, there is no doubt in the occult teachings, differ as the modern philosophies may about the matter. Moreover, it is a matter which may be determined by the conscious experience of anyone who will practice the exercises of the formulas, in the proper way. The I am will always be found at the center of the self, and will always respond I am. But when we attempt to describe this ultimate I, when we attempt to endow it with attributes, qualities, or peculiarities, then do we find ourselves at sea. For these things all belong to the plane of personality, while the I transcends personality, and cannot be expressed or designated in the terms of the latter. But, nevertheless, there is found a way of identifying the I. Philosophical psychology, both occult and popular, both esoteric and exoteric, gives us a term whereby we may discuss and consider the I, or ultimate element of self. This I, which we have stated as the final algebraical X, or unknown ultimate element of the self, is found to be identical with the highest philosophical and psychological conception of what has been called the will. Thus the X equals the will. Let us then try to understand the I by considering what the highest human thought reports regarding the will. By studying the symbol we may understand the reality. Brushing aside as unworthy the popular conception of the will, we find that the highest philosophical and psychological thought uses the term the will to designate the underlying essence of being, the fundamental life, mind spirit principle of the self. The ancient Greek philosophers so used the term. The original Buddhistic philosophy so employs it. We find it so used by eminent thinkers all through the history of philosophical thought. Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Wundt used the term in this sense. The Arcane teachers identified the principle of will with spirit, the essence, the beingness of being. The will is that essence or spirit, in the cosmos and in the individual, which is ever moving, changing its manifestations, flowing, evolving, proceeding, desiring, attaining, seeking, accomplishing. It contains within itself the potentiality of everything. But it itself cannot be said to be any of the things it manifests. Professor William Sturgis Bigelow. In his lecture on Buddhism and Immortality, delivered in Harvard University, 1908, published by Houghton Mifflin Company, New York, beautifully states the esoteric conception of will. In describing the Buddhistic conception of life and immortality, we take great pleasure in calling your attention to the following quotations from the said lecture. Professor Bigelow says,
"We are all, as we familiarly say, conscious of our own existence. Under this statement we habitually include, in more or less confusion, several distinct elements. First, the existence of our material bodies as objects of sensory perception. Second, of certain sensations, pleasurable or painful, originating not outside but inside the body itself. Third, of certain disturbances, that we classify as passions or emotions. Fourth, of what we call aptitudes and their opposites. Fifth, of desires or inclinations and their opposites. Lastly, of something of a wholly different character, consciously closer to the center than anything else, and differing from the other forms in being the only form of consciousness to which we are not passive. This we call will. We say, I feel sensation, pain or emotion. But we never say, I feel my will. It is always subjective and active. This will is a part of the normal consciousness of each one of you. Yet it is neither a part of sensation nor emotion, but, on the contrary, is capable of dominating both. What is it? Ask your own consciousness. Sensations originate outside and inside the body. Emotions, inside. But the will is deeper than either. And they are both objective to it. We cannot classify it with anything else. We cannot describe it in terms of any other form of consciousness. We are conscious through our bodies and of our bodies. But the consciousness of the will is direct. We cannot separate ourselves from it. We cannot stand off and examine it. We cannot modify it by anything else. It itself modifies everything within its scope. Other forms of consciousness are objective to it. But it is never objective to them. It may be overpowered by sensations, emotions, or passions, through its own weakness or their strength. It often is. But its attitude towards them, whether resisting or directing them, is always essentially and necessarily active. It exists in no other form than the subjective form. It is inconceivable in any other form. If it is not active, it is not will. There is nothing in our consciousness deeper. It underlies and overlays and permeates all other forms. And, moreover, what is of immeasurably more importance, it can, if need be, create them. Will is the assertion of a form of consciousness from the center outward. When this is opposed by another form of consciousness, intruding from the circumference inward, we recognize a hindrance to the free action of the will. And we talk of necessity. But such intrusive forms come from or through the material, separate personality. If it were not for these, the will would act freely. The separate personal consciousness with its offshoots is, therefore, the only obstacle to complete freedom of the will. Complete freedom of the will is complete freedom of consciousness, and complete freedom of consciousness from the habitual and empirical limitations of personality is complete freedom of the will. The terms are interchangeable. The only will that is not free is the personal will. Descartes said, I think, therefore, I am. It is an imperfect formula at best. But it would have been a better statement had he said, I will, therefore I am.
Thus do we find that the ego, or I, is, in its last possible human analysis, will. And thus do we find that will is in the nature of potential infinite manifestation of all activity, the essential beingness of all being, the plastic essence which may mold itself into any and all forms, the essence of activity which may manifest how and as it pleases, under the law always. As we said in Lesson 7, of the Arcane teaching, running back from cause to prior cause, and to still more remote precedent causes of his desires, the individual finds himself at last confronting the cosmic will. Retracing his path back to the present, he finds himself confronting his personal will which is moved by desire. In other words, he finds a chain of desire extending from the cosmic will to the personal will. A chain of countless links, having a beginning in will, and ending in will. An endless chain. Because it is a circle. Thereupon, he learns the first lesson of the arcane secret of the excluded middle, and thenceforth strives to realize the union of the two ends of will. From the realization of this union arises the individual will, the positive will of the ego. In this process, the law of cause and effect is not violated, but will is made the cause of will. The cause and effect merge. When this is attained, then does man indeed become the master.